like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like all the time.
All right, Morgoth, welcome back to the Jay Burton Show. How you doing, man?
Hello, Jay. I'm a little bit worn down, as I was just saying before we went live. I'm a little bit the end of year kind of burnout kicking in, and I want to make it into a kind of zone where I can justifiably do nothing in terms of the internet and everything, because then I'm in politics and commentary and all of that, because it's officially the Christmas holidays, and there's just a few days to go. So I'm looking forward. I genuinely take time out for Christmas. I always have. I've always looked forward to it.
Yeah, you're a better man than I am. I think I have only missed, in the 2.5 years of doing this show, I think I've only missed one episode at the normal schedule, and that certainly requires a little bit of pre-planning. But I think I may copy you, because at a certain point it's good to get a break. But I think that your point about just kind of the fatigue is one that I've definitely noticed, because obviously there was this massive, crescendo, in the lead up to the election, and then Trump won. And then in the months since, I said it haven't even been months, the 6 weeks since, it just feels like there's nothing worth saying. And, all of the kind of like right-wing dialogue seems to just be kind of rehashing, the same couple points over and over again.
Yeah, and I find myself kind of retreating into more sort of cultural things. I did an article on the Substack the other day which is purely by accident, where you draw on like a real world experience. And there was an old song, probably way too old for you, called Matchstalk Men and Matchstalk Cats and Dogs. And I heard an Irish version of it, and I thought that's different. It'd been so long since I'd heard the song. And I thought, this sounds different than I remember it. And I went and hunted it down. I looked it up, and then I realized there was the original one. And it fascinated me because the Irish one was a lot more upbeat and a lot more optimistic. And the original English one was, it had like the nostalgic sort of, like post-empire, post-glory days. Britain is like signified a lot of the times with brass bands, which are themselves sort of the Industrial Revolution. There's military connotations there. And it just sort of took me on this whole thing of like, isn't that a strange contrast when you think of the sort of the distinction between the English and the Irish soul? Because they both got their own scars. They've both had their own hardships and all of that. And they're like a kind of long history. But what I thought about the Irish one is that it's of the pub, and it's a lot more upbeat and optimistic. And the English one is just profoundly. What they're talking about, do you know the paintings of L.S. Lowry, where it's like matchstick men and it's a kind of bleak minimalist depiction of industrial landscapes in the north. And so that's that. It's a kind of anti-romanticism or something, but that's what the original song's singing about. So it's just sort of saturated in this commentary on the bleakness of the power and the people toiling away like little insects in the warehouses and in the foundries. And then afterwards, like, that's all gone. That's like the empire that they powered is also gone. And it's as if they're just left with this afterglow. And that's kind of not the Irish story at all. And I think it's reflected that. But I'm going off on an immediate, like, long-winded, sort of random tangent here, right at the start of the show. And I think that's fascinating. And to get back to the original thing, I find myself drawn into these kind of deep dive sort of abstractions and cultural quandaries rather than kind of chasing up the latest hot take or the latest happening on Twitter or something like that. And I don't know if that's an age thing or just kind of numbness and boredom with the sort of the political cycles.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the kind of differing character of the English and the Irish song, because just by happenstance, I think 2 out of the last 4 of the episodes of my show have been fairly deep dives into histories of specific populations in the British Isles, right? So Bagby and I we need to record part 2, did a deep dive into the American Scotch Irish, right? Which is obviously, deeply connected to, a very specific area of England, Scotland, and then later North Ireland. And then likewise, I also had, Will Tanner on to talk about, the Corn Laws, which, look, I'll admit, I kind of fall under that stereotype of, where Mark Twain said, God invented war so Americans would have to learn geography. I'll be honest, I know a little bit more about, British history than shall we say the average American, but not by much. And there's something kind of bizarre about the liberal conception of culture, right? Which, just kind of turns it into, kind of like the Disneyland version of that. There's this old Judge Dredd comic, and I can't remember which one. It's from the early 80s, right? Where Judge Dredd goes to Ireland. And in this kind of dystopian version of Ireland, right, the whole nation has been turned into sort of a Disneyland theme park, right, where everyone has to, live in these kind of, picturesque shacks, and they're only allowed to eat potatoes. It's basically a game reserved for the Irish. And yeah, sure, okay, we can look at that and kind of laugh and chuckle at it. But there is something to the fact that, right, like these cultural outputs are the result of very, very deep soil. Right. There's not something that is, just a kind of like a coat of paint. And, one of the things that makes me really sad is seeing the area I am from, the area I love, right? The American Mountain South, Appalachia, seeing it decay, and the forms, right? Things like bluegrass music, which I, dearly love, kind of decay with it. One of the things that I really despise about American folk music is that it's sort of been taken over by like, Brooklynite shitlibs. There are any number of these acts which, take on, the form, right? They take on the sort of the skin suit, but completely subvert it, right? They hate the people that make it, but they like the sound. And there's this one that I think of. He's actually quite a good singer, right? Tyler Childers. And I was going through his discography a while back, and it's, pretty standard stuff, right? But when I was digging through, I found out that he he made a BLM song. He made a song about the flawed racism of America, and just seeing that, right, the form of kind of the heritage Americans, right, the people who've been there since the very founding of the nation when it was still a colony, and using that to subvert them and attack them, it drove me nuts. So sorry, Morgoth, that's another long, unrelated.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the funny thing about Ireland is that it kind of was Disneyfied immediately before it got globo-homoed. And you get into this, because I've seen something similar with the north of England, which was kind of shabby, and it was... in the north of England, it was deindustrialized mainly in the 80s with Thatcher, especially where I come from with the coal mines. And they didn't really do anything much with it. They just closed the mines. So when I was growing up in North Tyneside, you had these huge, each village. I mean, the reason why each village existed in North Tyneside was mainly because they all formed around a pit, a mine. And so each village had like a gigantic heap of slag, as they call it, which is basically like the slate that comes. So you mine the coal, you take the coal, but then about like 90% of the stuff that you actually mine is just useless. It's just crap. It's just slate. So they had to find all of these innovative ways of like dealing with all of this sort of stuff which they couldn't use. And mainly it was just piled up in these giant heaps. Or they dumped it at sea. And when I was growing up, each village had its own sort of little mountain of slag in each of it, and everybody complained because it looked terrible. And we you would ride your BMXs or go on motorbikes, and it was like roller coasters. It was really dangerous because they'd get boggy and all of that. But there was a rawness to it, and there was a real character to it, and you weren't shying away from it. And now what they've done is like put some turf over the top of it and plant these pine trees in. So they've kind of covered up the reality of the North. Its ugliness, and it's the mines that used to power battleships for the British Empire. And they've turned them all into these sort of gay country parks where you go walking with your dog, and it's all very genteel. But what will happen is, because we're still on the North Coast, the wind comes across the North Sea, and it can be quite strong, and it blows all of these pine trees over because they've got no roots. And they can't sink their roots deep into the soil because there's no depth of soil there. It's just slate. And you see like a strong gust of wind, and it all comes over, and you see the secret is revealed. You just see this sort of bare slate and slag underneath of it all. And so there's this kind of element to it where we've detached ourselves, like literally, from our roots, and you just become a kind of, you just become a sort of bug man, and is semi-detached from where you come from and all of that. And it makes me sad, but of course, like, it's one of those things where if you complain about it, you just haven't got a leg to stand on, because objectively it does look nicer now. There's probably more wildlife now, and it's, you just find yourself on. It's like these people who say that they prefer brutalism over. Like they're nostalgic for brutalist architecture and stuff like that, and I do kind of sympathise with it. I do kind of sympathise with all of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, right? Literally, taking the slag heap and sort of painting over it. The sort of coal mining we did out here is slightly different, right? We didn't have the slag heaps, but one of the recent things that I've noticed is that my area went through sort of a series of changes, right? Kind of at the foot of the mountains. So within 20 minutes you're coal mining, and where I am, it's primarily agriculture. And for the longest time, right, it was cotton, and then that got made shall we say economically inviable, and then from there, right, it was tobacco for a long time. And then, tobacco was made sort of a target of the regime for reasons that are not particularly clear. So, all right, fair enough. We switched to dairy, and then, well, the same thing happens to dairy. So we switched to beef, and it's been beef for, 25, 30 years, and it seems like that's being targeted. And so what do? Right? Well, you got to use the land for something. I mean, a lot of people sell out, right? But they've started just covering over, this farmland with these massive solar farms. And it really doesn't make sense, from on a pure like dollars and cents perspective, but it's a massive eyesore. And, the fact that you basically are literally taking this land and locking it away under these kind of like, cybernetic panels, with government money. I don't know. There's some symbolism to that.
Yeah, it's coming in everywhere. That I've done a couple of streams and podcasts and stuff recently, and I've been mentioning, like, it's weird how in our sort of circles on the internet we tend to shy away from the climate change stuff, but the elite. I mean, in the Biden regime, I think Trump might chuck all of that stuff out, to be honest. But in Europe, in with like Starmer, they're going full ball, and it is crazy. Like, I know it's not like this hardcore taboo subject or anything, but they are going mad on this stuff. Like, it's going to fundamentally alter how we live. But I think it was Patrick Casey was saying it's InfoWars coded, so we just kind of shy away from it. It's a bit low status, and it's a bit kind of it's not our thing. And I think, oh well, okay, fair enough. We want to be on the cutting edge of commentary, but it's just like what 22 billion a year on this stuff, and what we're going to be. Where's the food coming from in the future? Where's what is this going to even work? I mean, people saying Germany's deindustrializing because they haven't got the energy capacity to keep things going. So there's real consequences of this stuff happening. I think it's crazy.
It's actually an interesting point, right? Because I felt the same thing, right? That there's sort of this like mental heuristic where if Alex Jones says something, it's probably not true. But at the same time, right, that same kind of energy agenda, it seems very sinister, especially when it doesn't seem to make sense, right? Like if the argument was, well, guess what? We developed a solar panel and it's, 10 times more efficient than what you've ever seen. You put up something that, the size of your television on the roof of your house and you got power for the rest of your life. Fair enough, right? I'm sold. I get it. But, it seems to be, if your primary interest was, purely creating energy and making people's lives better, you wouldn't go with this. And then on the other hand, you have, I'll put it this way, our elites haven't exactly convinced us that they have our best interest in mind. You can understand why people are suspicious. And you brought up something there that I wanted to talk to you about, which is, it seems like in America and honestly in other places in the West as well, there's a desire to kind of take the foot off the gas, right? To reduce the pace of entropy. But in the UK, right, the Keir Starmer government seems to be, full speed ahead, just veering towards the ravine. Now, obviously, some of that happened with the riots, the response to that. Some of it happened, with other kind of issues. But the energy one is another example. And you released a piece I thought was quite good, where you kind of hypothesized that the UK could turn into sort of a woke North Korea, right? This sort of like isolated state holding on to the ideology of yesteryear. And I'm curious, could you explain your thought process there?
Yeah, I mean, the woke North Korea thing was just after the riots that we had. There's a few twists and turns in that sense, and I wasn't one of those things where you say this is going to happen. I tend to shy away from making predictions, but I will put it out there with a bit of a question mark and kind of weigh up the pros and cons. And it was in the aftermath in Starmer's. I think I did that video like 2 months ago or something, and it was there was just one issue after another, which was like pounding Labour. They're just in. They've only been in for 6 months, and they were just poking everybody in the eye. They annoyed everybody, and they didn't seem to care how unpopular they were going to get. And so in the wider context of the kind of the discussion about whether the woke is being put away or not, I was kind of thinking, well, okay, let's just assume that it is. Is Keir Starmer and this crazy Labour government going to bend the knee to Trump and all of this? And my point was that I don't think it will. So you'd get this weird situation where they cling on to this sort of dead political formula from, say, 2021, when it was at its peak, or 22 or whatever. Whereas the rest of the world's moved on. Say, the European Union have got to get to grips with geopolitical realities because Russia's right on their doorstep, and they've got Ukraine, and they're dealing with all that kind of thing. And then then in America you've got Trump and sort of the tech bro takeover, and they are, so that's where it's going to be the tip of the spear of rolling the woke back, let's say. And then I was like, well, so in Britain we're just going to be sort of stuck like with this old sort of political formula where it's like 2027 and we're still like celebrating George Floyd Day or all of the just, the rainbow flags are still adorning all of the brands in the UK and everything, and everybody else has it around the world, around the West. They haven't seen them for years, and it will be like in Cuba when people were driving around in bodged up cars that were 40-year-old and all that kind of. So you're clinging on to this political formula, which is sort of still alive or on life support. And everywhere else, it's kind of just doesn't exist anymore. But the funny thing is, he's came out and he's started attacking the Tories on immigration, as if there's going to be this pivot back to a kind of pragmatic lurch back to the centre ground, get to grips on the craziness of the Tory immigration policy. Trudeau did that, something similar as well. And funny enough, today there's been another twist in the road, where what we've got going on is you've got Nigel Farage in the Reform Party, which is to the right of, in theory, to the right of the Conservatives. It's supposed to be a genuine alternative to the Conservatives, which have become a bit of a joke. Where it gets interesting is that Elon Musk was meeting with Farage the other day, and I thought this is interesting because now the kind of the woke North Korea sort of thing is back on the table here, because if this is it, if they want to have a kind of British MAGA, or what would it be called, like Baga or something? I don't know what it'd be called. I'm too tired. And with Musk books backing it all up to take out the woke, like sort of Starmer government, then they may double down in the face of that, or they may like sort of decide to make a draw, because here there's not really going to be much scope for putting the woke away. They're going to be under attack straight away in a similar way as what they say Kamala Harris was, except we've got years to go. And I was thinking about this today because it turns out, well, first of all, my take when I just saw it was that I put a poll out and I said who would win on Twitter. I did it. Who do you think will win, the Starmer-Tron or Farage-Musk alliance? And everyone put Farage-Musk alliance, and I actually think that's not the case. I think the British left would beat the Farage-Musk alliance, which is an unpopular point of view, but I think they would, and I can explain why as well. And that was before. I think because the problem that they've got, just to sort of get into the nuts and bolts of this, is that they're already saying in the British sort of shit-lib press that it should not be allowed where a foreign billionaire just blatantly bankrolls a kind of populist movement in Britain, which is fair enough. Now, that's obviously like the hypocrisy. It is. They're total hypocrites. They don't mind being bankrolled by billionaires themselves whatsoever. But what that allows them to do is lean in to something which would really energize the base around Keir Starmer, even though like nobody likes him very much, because it would be reframed as a kind of, here come this MAGA kind of plague is now being bankrolled in our country, and this is no longer a kind of grassroots populism. It's obviously a foreign import. And against that, the Keir Starmer would be framed as being this kind of boring, doddering British bureaucrat, but he would be British. Like, it would be, look, it wouldn't be true. He is British, but what I mean is that the hypocrisy does stink. But just in terms of forming a narrative, the British left would be able to form a good one. And it would also be obviously true that reform was just like this astroturf populist offshoot of the Trump movement, which is kind of inherently tech bro, Zionist, billionaire backed. And I actually think they would. I actually think they wouldn't score a win on that. I mean, this is all quite hypothetical because we haven't got an election for years, and you've still got the Tory party into that mix. But even then, I then saw that the Daily Telegraph had said the Tony Blair Institute had said that Elon Musk or at least foreign billionaires should not be allowed to bankroll political agendas in the UK. Again, the hypocrisy is rank. But then you've also got the Dark Lord coming in and deciding, like, yeah, I'm going to be on the side of Starmer here. I'm going to take the side of Labour. That was the signal that was going up. And I thought it was this kind of, the scene is being set for the greatest of all clown shows, where you've got like a kind of Godzilla versus King Kong scenario where Tony Blair takes on Elon Musk, and Tony Blair and Keir Starmer versus Nigel Farage and Elon Musk is sort of super SmackDown special, which I think the British left would come out on top of.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are several things I want to address there, which is, first of all, again, I'm not a local, but even halfway across the world, it is very obvious that reform is completely astroturfed. One of the interesting things is it seems as if there's a segment of the British press that is sort of trying to set up Farage as the opposition to Starmer, right? Painting him as perhaps more of a quote unquote threat than he actually is, because he seems very just low energy to me. The conservatives have, and honestly, I'm almost impressed by the conservatives' ability to destroy themselves. Like this Kami Badenoch woman, who is someone I have a difficult time discussing within the parameters allowed on YouTube, and I'll leave it at that, seems to just be this kind of like just odious joke, right? I have no idea who she is for. I mean, she herself claims to represent the interest of Nigerians. But to me, it's a very bizarre situation where, Labour is extraordinarily unpopular, but so are the Conservatives, and the sort of selected opposition is fake. I don't, and look, I might be wrong, but I don't see that as being a grassroots support. To your point about, who wins in a fight between, the English left and, the American Musk network, it's an interesting point. And part of it hinges on to what degree is Britain a sovereign country, right? And I don't say that out of any glee, right? It's just, it's an open question, right? To what degree can Starmer make his own calls? And I would not be surprised if you were right, because, it seems as if they're already doing any number of things to kind of sabotage their nation. And so if Musk basically says, well, I'm going to take my ball and go home, and takes with him, Twitter, X, and all of his other stuff, I don't see that being enough of a deterrent. I mean, sorry, do you see what I'm getting at there, Morgoth?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the question that's interesting here is that because if you say, well, they're gonna, it would then be the case that it wouldn't be so much Elon Musk, but the American State Department or the American deep state, or the banks would have to have a word, which I think they might have done with Rishi Sunak when they said, like, it's time to step down. We need Starmer in. And I think that is what happened. I think they were told, you're too unpopular, you're too stupid, everybody's sick and tired of you. We have a lot of very unpopular things to bring in, and we want a skullcracker to come in and get it done who doesn't care about how unpopular he is. So if that's the case, then it's like Starmer's their guy. And that puts the kind of Elon Musk situation into a new light. Now, in terms of the Tony Blair Institute and his connections with, the Davos, and because Tony Blair's a thoroughgoing globalist, as is Keir Starmer. And the thing is, when you actually have a look at the agendas they want, they're actually quite similar. Like Tony Blair's all in on climate change, all in on digital IDs, all of this kind of thing. But then again, so is Elon Musk. It's just that Elon Musk makes it trendy. But the actual outcomes are just the same. It's just that he has better optics. Which, I mean, he may bring all of this stuff in America and people will cheer it on. Whereas when Keir Starmer tries to do pretty much the same thing, everybody hates him, and they're talking about it's the Great Reset, it's Davos controlling everything. But there does seem to be a genuine rift there, and I think there will. There was a thing came out. There was a leak came out because during the American election, this is another reason why I think they hate the Labour Party, is that during the American election, Labour sent over 300 frontline activists to work for Kamala Harris, to campaign for Kamala Harris. They sent in backups, it was like the elves arriving at Helm's Deep or something like that, coming in for Kamala's. So I remember at the time, they were saying, the American MAGA movement was saying that this is outrageous. You can't have this foreign country interfering so directly in our election. And now, of course, it's like, oh, well, now that we've won, we're going to start funneling money into the opposition against Labour. So that's part of it. You can't say it's all just fun and games. It's all just kind of bullshit. I'm tempted to think that is a genuine rift. I think that is something not quite right. I think they really don't like each other, the British government. And again, the reason why I think it would probably be a good outcome would be because it's very difficult for the British left to actually point to an enemy because Keir Starmer's a globalist and he's barely ever in the country. He's always going around to swanky dinners and visiting countries and shaking hands with Larry Fink from BlackRock and all of this stuff. So it's hard to depict them as being the underdogs. But what they can do is easily create a narrative where the Trump government, Elon Musk, and billionaire tech bro money is now being funneled in to undermine our good old fashioned doddering bureaucrat. And we're all going to rally around him to sort of get rid of this foreign astroturf, which is stirring up trouble in our country. That's a narrative that I think would work. I think that'll grow legs. I think they will put up a hell of a fight and might win, especially if they bring in Tony Blair to pull strings on their behalf. Because otherwise, what is it? I wonder if it is just all for the amusement of these people, like a kind of chess game or something like that. But the outcomes are not really that consequential. I don't know. I think it might be. I think Musk's starting to go a little bit rogue on them. Another thing they did, which I meant to mention before, was that when they were talking about how to combat MAGA, they said the number one thing you have to do is to kill X, to kill Twitter X. That came from somewhere in the Labour government, the Labour think tanks or whatever. And Musk knows that as well. So that there's no love lost between them, even if eventually it is just all a big puppet show.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. I was speaking to Charles Haywood earlier today. For those listening to the podcast, this will be 2 days ago on your feed. And one of the things that we talked about, right, is the idea that you don't necessarily have to love Musk, right? I think he's involved in any number of kind of sinister projects. But at the same time, the fact that there are multiple power interests at once is at the very least better than it being a monolith. right? It is better than this kind of like horrifying one-party rule. Now, albeit, right, there are still things built into that I'm not thrilled about, but, we were not given, we weren't given a lot of choices here, right? And I think that in the US, one of the interesting things will be if in a hypothetical situation where there is a choice to be made between tech bro backing and Likud party backing, who wins out? I'm not saying that it's incredibly likely to go one way or the other, but the fact that that's at least a discussion, it's an interesting place to be. Because, I think one of the concerns is basically America is being offered a containment deal where you can get one or two things you want, but the highest priority of the regime, that stays. And for a very long time, the highest priority has been a certain Middle Eastern democracy, right? So I'm curious, right, what seems to be, from your perspective, the highest priority of the British regime?
Well, in terms of foreign policy, it'll just be doing whatever the Americans want. But here, especially they do go all in on the Israel thing as well. Where it diverges is with Ukraine, because the Europeans in general, and absolutely the British government, seem almost to have a different agenda to not so much Biden, but definitely to the Trump administration. And there's all kinds of weird things going on. Like the other day, Keir Starmer was he popped up and he was surrounded by soldiers with lots of different flags. And it turned out that what went out it was broadcast as him standing on the Russian border in Estonia. Now, as it turns out, he was actually on a warship, which was in port in Estonia on the Russian border. So it wasn't as bad as what you may think. But then you're thinking to yourself, right, so we do actually have troops on the Russian border then, don't we? Like this is where we are at this moment. And this is crazy. The European situation, they don't seem to be giving up on Ukraine at all. In fact, the last I heard, they're trying to do this new thing where they send soldiers from around Europe, say from France and Germany and whatnot, and they place them in Ukraine, but not under the NATO banner. So they can kind of get around it. It's not a NATO thing. So then, if they get attacked, all of the NATO protocols won't come in, and it won't affect America. But in reality, they're expecting that America will be drawn in. There's a massive difference with the way that the continental Europeans are looking at Ukraine and the Trump administration. And that's a huge rift. But in terms of the tech bros and the tech bros, they're not as prominent in Britain or Europe. We seem to have different ones. We seem to have a different systems here. I mean, we don't really have any of that anyway. Really, there's a graph that goes around, which is like European tech startups compared to America, and the European ones is tiny. So, yeah, there's just not much of a tech bro faction in Europe, I don't think. But we do have the other one for the Middle Eastern country, though, of course.
Yeah, and honestly, to me, one of the things that I went on right after the election, I went on to the Longhouse podcast, right, which is a couple of Scandinavian guys, and I think a Finn too. And I was kind of joking and kind of not, right, talking about, my expectations, right? Those guys are all pretty black-pilled about the scenario. And I don't mean that in just like a purely derogatory sense. But one of the interesting dynamics is it seems as if within the U.S. empire, there's a faction that believes we are overextended, right? That we're in a bad spot. And, you've seen that in the language about Ukraine. And will America pulling back from Ukraine screw over a great number of Ukrainians and also the rest of Europe? Quite possibly, yes. And so, for guys who really do have, Russians on the border, I certainly feel some sympathy for it. But at the same time, like, I live in America. I don't want a great deal of my money being sent to, basically shoot into the mud in Ukraine, let alone the possibility of it, kind of turning into a wider war. And I think one of the interesting questions is like, okay, like, let's say that you think what I do, right? Which is that the American empire is, is evil and needs to go away. Which is a better move for you, right? Is it basically to say, no, double down on, all of these stupid foreign wars, in the hope that sometime in the short term, you will, increase the contradictions within the system, right? To take up Marxist language and have the whole thing fall apart. Or is it to say like, hey, look, let's try to get America out of Europe as much as we possibly can? And I think it's an interesting question. I mean, maybe just given my kind of religious views, I'm kind of dubious about accelerationism. But one of the things I always think about is I've got a lot of contacts in South Africa, and there's this really interesting account. It goes by the name Canine Reaper. He works as private security, right, in South Africa. His X account is both a little bit gruesome and really interesting. And I've talked to him maybe 2 or 3 times, and actually he was just on Will Tanner's show, which I'll recommend. And one of the things he mentions is that accelerationism doesn't work. And the reason he knows it doesn't work is he lives in South Africa, right? This kind of like semi-failed state, where you have politicians saying, we need to kill a certain ethnic group quite regularly. And he's like, there are still liberals, right? They're still there. And so, when we look at something like the Ukraine war or America's other kind of foreign endeavors, I understand the idea that, like, let's burn it out. Let's get rid of it. But I don't think that would work. And so to me, if I see an indication from the empire that, maybe even in a very narrow sense, saner heads are prevailing, I see that as a very, very limited reason for hope.
I think the acceleration. I'd like to, it's kind of strange because there's there's a certain faction of is it the NAFO types where their view on all of this is that if America left Europe, I think it is. There's different stripes. But you get the ones where you get some people, I think like Richard Spencer would be, where we need to have one Western bloc and it needs to have a mission. And the mission is to smack these other countries into their place, and this gives a kind of meaning to Western power, which is more interesting than what I think people give it credit for, because it's Richard Spencer who comes out with this stuff. But I do kind of get it. I do kind of get that kind of unapologetic, like, yeah, your side of this should go down and not us. But then there's another wing of that, and it's much more Eurocentric. And that would be where, okay, America leaves Europe when then we have to fend for ourselves. And it would be like this kind of jolt to the system where we'd have to find our balls again, and we'd have to get back to the old ways. We'd have to find out how to stand on our own 2 feet again, because you get these kind of Americans where they'll say like the reason why you've got all of these benefits in Europe is because like American divisions are they stationed there. They don't have to pay for the military. They're living in this kind of they've been reduced to this kind of Disneyland where Europe is no longer active politically in the world. It's just a kind of retirement home and a set of museums. Like, that might be painful for some people to hear, but it is kind of true, to be honest. On the other hand, it does open up a kind of harshness to the world. And maybe that's what people in Europe need. Maybe it's finally time to get over the big sort of post-war coma and re-enter the world and say, well, yeah, so we're going to have to make some drastic changes. The European Union would have to be kind of formalized into an empire. It would have to stop being gay. The immigration stuff would have to be sorted out. You would have to have programs of patriotism and national pride again. It would give purpose. They would have to bring purpose back. It would be a bit like sort of putting the World War II guilt away. That's something I think is interesting, and you see it kind of poking out a little bit in the situation with Ukraine. I mean, I think what's actually going to happen is that I think they're going to wind it down with Trump. And you're going to have all of these European forces building up on the borders and kind of preparing for something else a few years down the line.
It's an interesting point because I've actually felt very much the same way, right? That there are a lot of things about Europe that are completely and totally artificial. Now, were those the decision of Europeans? No, they were conquered, right? So I get that. I'm not trying to assign, guilt or blame. But nonetheless, right, in the 80 years of basically being kept on a game preserve, they've sort of stopped being nations in the same way, right? And we mentioned earlier, right, that the question of is Britain sovereign? Well, let's just say, like, honestly, European nations are not sovereign, right? We've seen this in the sense that, France wants to kind of play colonialism again, and all of a sudden there are all these, magic coups that happen, right? They don't get what they want. There are a number of these, right? Germany wants a pipeline. Just by sheer random chance, the pipeline has an accident, right? It's sort of mafia-esque. And so if we accept that premise, it's like, okay, well, I'm someone who, despite not living there, wants Europe to do well. They in order to do that, they require, sovereignty again. So, okay, like obviously, the American empire needs to pull back in order for that to happen. But what does sovereignty actually look like? Well, obviously, you have the ability to declare war, right? You're in charge of yourself. But with that comes consequences, right? With that comes the fact that, if you've set up a nursing home society, well, you're footing the bill for it in a very different way. Or if you've, neglected to, invest in, an army, well, guess what? That's something you need to do now. And similarly, right? Like a lot of people are in abstract, big fans of European wars, right? You'll have people say like, oh, that's what made Europe great, but are also very, very upset at the idea that they might actually have to fight a war. And again, I think that what comes with this is, the death of a certain form of romantic nationalism, right? Which is like, look, like nationalism in itself, right, it's not, okay, obviously nations have existed from time immemorial, but the idea that a people gets their own nation where they are in charge is a relatively new concept, right? People have obviously been fighting for that. You have the zealots, before the time of Christ, the Gauls pick your poison, but the idea of giving every people their own nation state is a new thing. And if you take away the kind of Team America world police, right, the rules-based, international order, well, that goes away too. And you get things that are messy and uncomfortable and very unpleasant, especially if you're a smaller nation. But fundamentally, that's real. That's how the world works. And if you don't want that to be the case, well, guess what? You've got this combination nanny state and world policeman of America. And so it basically seems like either, you get reality, both good and ill, or you get, gay space communism.
Yeah, and I mean, look, some of this would be negative for America as well. Like the whole thing with the pipeline with between, if you look at it from the perspective of Germany, there's as it stands now, there's not really a great deal of, like, Germany gets more out of a good friendship with Russia than it does out of anything from America. But the cost of that would be coming to an agreement on how far east the NATO actually goes. So the Germans can say, well, it stops. For example, the last air base will be in Germany and no further east, because we don't want that jeopardizing our relationship with Russia, which of course is not how this turned out at all. But what that would have done, of course, would have curtailed the American empire. But because Germany is not sovereign, it had no stake in it. But if it was, you will see some, as you said, like some very unpleasant and painful outcomes, because some of those Eastern European countries will probably get thrown to the dogs. But that's actually what generally tended to happen throughout history. If you just go back and look at European history, that's the way it tended to go anyway.
Well, exactly, right. And I think that, in a broader sense, it's easy to get kind of frustrated, with people who have kind of like grand sweeping ideas, but are not really familiar with the negative side effects. Like you're speaking about the kind of negative impacts for America. I mean, this is something I think about, all the time, right? So, okay, globalism seems to be in a certain degree kind of coming to an end. Okay, you can't get, free stuff from, or, practically free stuff from China. It becomes more expensive to make things. Your cost of living goes up, right? That's a very real cost. Similarly, right? Let's say Trump gets exactly what he wants and, deports, 10 to 30 million people. You can do that. I would like for him to do that, but that will have very real externalities, right? Like, we make fun of the kind of like liberal lefty types for saying like, oh, well, who will tend to my garden? And of course that's ridiculous, right? These kind of champagne socialist types, but they're not entirely wrong, right? As someone who worked construction when I was in college, the vast majority of people I worked with were, shall we say, not legal residents, right? That goes away. You have a problem. And again, simply by there being an issue, that doesn't mean you should avoid it, right? Effectively, right? This is the art of politics, right? You're weighing pros and cons, trade-offs to try to get to a desired goal. But it simply is. There's nothing more to say than that. And I guess that, to me, I sort of long for a return to kind of that level of real politics, where, yeah, sure, the world is scary and uncomfortable. That's kind of normal for human existence. But for so long, right, this kind of like fake post-war consensus, the kind of internal politics of the American empire have been locked in this very weird state where everything is slowly getting worse. And the whole conversation is about, largely unimportant details, right? It's maddening. And, to a certain extent, right, we're sort of seeing a return of, the old gods, right? The end of history is over. And while there are certainly downsides to that, war, famine, take your pick, but also there's sort of an honesty to it that I think the West has lacked since really World War II.
Yeah, I mean, something that I've been seeing more and more recently is that, especially when it comes to immigration, because the part of the thing with immigration, which people tend to sort of shy away from, is that it is popping up. It in a certain way, it is actually propping up economic model based on infinite growth in nations with below replacement birth rates. Like, I know, like, this is not to say that it isn't a malicious conspiracy or anything, but it's certainly an element to it. And what I think is like an interesting question is that if you want to go all in on this, if you want to deport everybody, there is going to be like material concessions which have to be made. And I think people would prefer not to think about that. Give me a second, the dog. And I think people would prefer not to think about that, and just sort of wish it away. And when you say that it's purely a malicious conspiracy, it kind of gives you an easy off ramp, because then you can say, well, at the end of the day, we've solved the conspiracy. We're going to send them all back, and then everything will be hunky dory. Under the present economic model, you will actually find hardship. I think there will be ramifications of that, and I would say you're going to have to just take that on the chin and say, yeah, there will be, but it'll be better than going extinct. It'll be better than the kind of just complete societal collapse and sectarianism, which is beginning to form itself. And maybe your dinner will be like bacon and cabbages instead of whatever French or Spanish imports you can buy for the cheap in the supermarket and all the rest of it. But people prefer even like sort of nationalists and stuff. I think they find like, well, we just won't have to confront these things, and I'm like, you will have to confront this stuff. There's hardship coming, one way or another, and you can keep, the system thinks they'll just keep flooding the zone with immigrants to keep the economics of it creaking along a little bit longer, or you can say, well, everything will be okay if we just deport them all. Somehow we will muddle along. And I'm like, well, I don't think so either, because, if you've got lots of old people and too few young people, it won't. And it's like, look, it's gonna be hard. Sorry, but hardship is coming. There's no way around it. And it's like everybody on all sides of the political spectrum are kind of in denial that this is going to happen.
Yeah, actually, I gave a speech on a similar topic to a group of guys in the Pacific Northwest. And there's two ways to look at that, right? One, which, sort of adopts the kind of modern premise, is like, oh no, the whole point of life is to maximize my personal self-enjoyment, right? That is the purpose of human civilization. And I obviously, I think that idea is wrong. There are higher principles than merely, your own personal enjoyment. There's a reason that we decry, the baby boomer who sells their farm to go live on a cruise ship, right? But on the other hand, right, like if we accept that, hard times are coming, winter is coming, I mean, it's probably not going to be particularly pleasant for you and I, Morgoth, right? But on a civilizational level, that might be what we need, right? That's sort of a eugenic process, right? But when we talk about these kind of social fabrics, like the British brass band, all of these, well, they were born out of a time of limitation, right? They were born out of a time with very real material constraints. All these other kind of like social institutions, whether it's, religion, marriage, national consciousness, are all born of a world where they're needed, right? They grew up as kind of an evolutionary response to very real outside pressures. You take those away, and to be honest, it's no shock that those have wasted, right? Like if you sit in your chair all day for a few years and try and get up, you won't be able to walk, right? Those muscles will have atrophied. And we're seeing that on a civilizational scale. And this is something that you even see in scripture, right? Well, why does God command the Israelites to spend 40 years in the desert? The kind of like fedora tipping atheist answer is, oh, haha, how stupid. They couldn't make a 7-day journey in 40 years. Well, really, right? The point of it is that was a people they were slaves, right? They'd grown up in captivity. And in order to create a warrior people, right? Someone who could conquer, those people needed to die out, and they needed to be people used to hardship, right? You see the same thing in Frank Herbert's Dune, right? Like, why did the Fremen conquer the stars? Well, because they've been exposed to the deserts of Arrakis for thousands of years, right? It hardened them. And again, you mentioned this kind of like nursing home society, and it's like, it's true, and it's something that can be overcome, right? We can go back to being kind of a healthy society, a culture that's real. We can rejoin the connection between man and culture, but it's impossible to do that and to maintain an ever increasing standard of living.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen scenarios already in across the West. Well, let's just stick with Britain, which I find more bleak. Some of these towns in Yorkshire or Birmingham or obviously London, they're now so bleak because they're kind of dilapidated and thoroughly ethnically alien. But at the same time, you've still got a mixture of kind of swindling and money laundering schemes as well as all of the Globo Homo brand. So you get like the worst of everything. You've got decay plus globalism kind of mixed up in this toxic brew. Whereas if you went back and it was like 2005, it was all the bright glittering lights of globalism and whatnot. And something that fascinates me is if Donald Trump creates incentives to bring all of these corporations back to America, and you can look at a country like Ireland, where I just think this is like the perfect thing, where Ireland kind of set itself up as a tax dodge for Apple and Google and all of these, Amazon and all these giants, and that's kind of what its economy is. And there's a bit of panic on because they're thinking, well, if Donald Trump kind of gets them all to go back to America, where does that leave us? And my kind of view on that is it's going to leave you what you were in the early 1980s, because it's not that we're going back to the Stone Age. It's that you can look at a soap opera from the 1970s or something, and you can see that it wasn't, even if it was the 1940s or the 1950s. I'll deal with those material conditions. I don't think it was too bad. I think we can survive it. I wish people would stop being so scared. The alternative is absolute ruination. You don't come back from that. You can do fine if you're wearing overalls and you've got the local village and the local town centre is having to plant potatoes and alongside the roads or all this kind of thing, as we've done before many times. We can deal with that. But what you can't deal with is collapse when you're an ethnic minority. That's the end game. That's nightmare fuel. We can deal with hard times. We've dealt with them in the past for many, many, many much worse than what we'll deal with now. And I just find it strange that people are so horrified by it. Obviously, the elites themselves have got their own incentives to keep this monstrous system kind of creaking along. I did an article which is kind of related to this, called "Is the West an Elephant on Stilts?" a few years ago, but it was mainly looking at the internet cables and infrastructure. But it's just this idea where that kind of Salvador Dali thing of elephants on stilts, like creaking along. We've just got to prop it all up for a bit longer. And I think, if you just had to go down onto the ground, it's not so bad. In fact, it's a lot healthier than what we've got now. The horror, the daily misery and horror mixed with a kind of failed promise of progress. Where because we can only ever progress, because this kind of liberal idea of that it will only ever get better, and there's this kind of cope baked into the system and the average shitlib and the masses that we're still somehow heading towards the Star Trek universe, and we're just so obviously not. Like that time that's at least 20 years out of date now, but we can't admit it. We've got to live in denial about it. And we can't like step off and think, yeah, we're going to have some downtime and we're going to have to clean house. And it becomes psychotic. And in Britain, everything gets warped and twisted to the lie. The laws are changed to adhere to this, like, obviously unnatural state of affairs of just endless flows of foreigners coming in. It's not normal. It's not natural. So they just change the laws to make it more difficult and it just like heaps misery upon misery. And I'll take the hard times. I'll take the material hard times over that, because in the long term, it wouldn't even be that bad. One of the major crises that we've got is like the housing shortage. If you just had to say, look, let's just struggle with this, you will find weird outcomes. Like everybody could have a house, a nice sized house, and who knows, that may actually create a situation where the women don't have to go out to work anymore and they can have kids. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? But of course, this is all assuming that your nation is run in the interests of people and not merchants and banks.
Well, I think that brings up an interesting question, right? Which is one that I've been thinking about a lot, right? Which is, what can you expect from your elite? Because look, I'm not some kind of Pollyanna. I understand humans always are, to a certain degree, self-motivated. But at the same time, right, the kind of radical disdain our elites have for, their alleged constituents is ridiculous, right? Like, I can't remember the name of him, some, horrible, limey political commentator during the farmers' protests, who, when asked what he would do, he basically said, do what Thatcher did to the miners, right? Send in the hounds. It's that attitude, right, is, I'm struggling for words that I can say within the kind of speech constraints of YouTube, right? I don't like it. And again, what can we expect? Like, I'm not looking for a philosopher king, but I'm looking for someone who doesn't hate us, at the very minimum. And so, I think that, one of the things about that's at least kind of hopeful about a place like America is that it has a certain amount of human capital that, could be recognized, right? If there were eyes to see. And, again, in kind of conditions of scarcity, those resources will become more necessary, I guess. But Morgoth, we're over time. I've really enjoyed speaking to you again. I'll have to have you on in another year, which seems to be about our pace. But is there anything you want to say as we wrap up?
No, not really. You can find my stuff on Substack, and everything I do goes on Substack, and I still crank out the odd YouTube video here and there, and I tend to pop up a little bit on shows and things. So yeah, I'll wish you a Merry Christmas.
Again, Merry Christmas, Morgoth. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, the link's in the description for something more direct, or you can check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. JD, personal friend of mine, highly recommend his services. Again, Morgoth, thank you so much for coming on. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.